I want to introduce you to Dr. John Patrick. John's a close personal friend since I heard an excellent talk he did on the myth of moral neutrality. John is the professor in biochemistry and pediatrics at the University of Ottawa. They probably should add to that he's also quite the philosopher. He's very active in the Christian Medical and Dental Society of Canada. He's been involved in mission work in Central Africa. He usually goes there every summer, taking a group of medical students to deal with problems of malnutrition and really expose them to what missions is like up close. His wife managed a project for 7,000 Rwanda refugees last summer. This is a terrific family, and I think you're really going to enjoy getting to know John and his keen wit, wisdom, and insight. He's going to challenge us all. John, it's great to have you with us, and you've had such a varied background, including, I know you and I have something in common. We've spent time in Africa. What made you go to Africa, and what did you learn there? I mean, that you'd want to share with our members.
The first thing I learned by going to Africa is that God writes incredibly good stories. My going to Africa actually began before I was born, in a strange way. My grandfather was a Rolls-Royce toolmaker and a Marxist.
And a Marxist.
That's
an interesting combination.
Early trade union leader. Self-taught man, read Shaw, Shakespeare, Marx and Engels pretty well. Thought that academics were worth nothing. Because he was also a just man, when my mother, who was one of 8 children, got a scholarship to go to university, he wouldn't let her take it up because he said, I can't afford to send 8 children, I won't send one. So she ended up as a seamstress in Birmingham. Not a very happy young woman, but God put her next to a Christian woman who realized that this was somebody who was not happy. And she invited her to come to their church because they had some extraordinary speakers that week. And my mother, in effect, said, sure, I'll come, I've got nothing better to do. Well, these extraordinary speakers were a couple of missionaries who'd gone to the Belgian Congo with C.T. Studd and had lived in the middle of the Ituri forest at that stage for 20 years or more on the basis of prayer. They prayed for everything, whether it be breakfast or that the lion would stay outside the tent or whatever. And so my mother heard this story of praying for breakfast, so to speak, or tickets, and her jaw dropped. She'd never heard anything like it. So she went back again, and of course the inevitable happened. She said, I want a bit of this lifestyle, this way of living, this way of understanding. She became a Christian. And so after that she wrote to these good people who had foregone the pleasures of family in order to be missionaries, because they did not think the Ituri forest in the early part of this century was a place to bring up children. So they took the young people who became Christian on their very infrequent furloughs as children from the Lord. So my mother started to write, and in those days the mail got to the Ituri forest, unlike today. So they knew when my mother got engaged and married and when I was conceived. And in 1987 I finally learnt that they'd put me on their prayer list every day from the moment they heard of my conception, and they had the following prayers. They would become a Christian, a doctor, and that I would go to help in the Belgian Congo. Now,
so it was laid up against you from an early age.
It was set, yeah, the story was set up. But nobody told me.
Yeah.
There was no pressure. Just to show you what these extraordinary prayers were, I suppose there would be 400 houses in the street where I grew up, and since 1930, 3 boys have gone to university from that street.
How many?
3.
3, my goodness.
And only 1 is a doctor.
That's you.
That's me. So I went to university, then did well, never went inside an academic department, really. Went round the postgraduate training institutions in London, got my MRCP, board certified internal medicine type thing very quickly. Did a bit of gastroenterology, neurology, respirology, cardiology, infectious diseases, pediatrics, nephrology. They all interest me, they all bored me after a while. And then I'd got married during that period, and my wife complained that was not seeing much of the kids. So I did a PhD, because that gave me a lot more time at home. And after we'd completed that, we both wanted to travel, so we quite cynically looked for a way to apply my research to a developing world problem, and I discovered that what I'd done in terms of electrolyte physiology could be very interestingly applied to the problem of malnourished children, so I went to Jamaica for 5 years. Eventually took a missionary out to lunch, which is always a dangerous thing to do.
Yeah. He
discovered very quickly that I knew as much about the treatment of malnourished children as anyone did at that stage. And he told me they had a huge problem where they were, and I said, can't be that big, you're doing something wrong in your measurements. And he said, well, you better come and help. And I said, well, in principle, yes, and under my breath, in practice, no. And I set a whole slew of barriers between me and going to Africa. The money would have to come from somewhere. I'd have to meet the guy who was running the hospital, Tim Kratzer, as it turned out. And various other things had to fit in. I thought, there's no way these will all fit together. My family, meanwhile, said, this is a great idea, we're all coming. So the kids had got a group of 8 together by this stage. And they'd worked it out, they'd signed themselves out of public school and do a correspondence program for a year, etc. Then I got a new graduate student who, lo and behold, was marrying into a travel agency, so the costs of getting there dropped. Then I got a letter from the local Rotary Club saying they were looking for a project. I went to visit them just out of good intent, and they gave me $6,000. Just like that. I've never seen it happen before or since. Then I took a visiting professorship to Indianapolis, and lo and behold, that's where Tim Kratzer was, and he was home, and he was a quiet American. So everything was removed, and I called my father and said, you might be interested, we're going to Zaire this summer. And my father said, I've waited 47 years to hear you say that. So off we went, and first of all, did what I knew would be the case, set up a program that would rapidly resuscitate malnourished children. We could get 1 kilogram a month on them with no trouble at all while we were doing it. Lots of people have done that before, but nobody's ever done anything about the prevalence. Nutrition education just doesn't work. And we were there, and then we go away and come back, and the program would slide downhill while we were away, and we'd come back a year later, and it would bump up again and slide down again. The usual pattern. And then some of the local women would start teasing the women who came to the nutrition village that they were bad mothers, and that was the end of the program. It was killed by the local people, which is something that's been described and is common enough. And meanwhile, I was struggling. Why was this the case? I knew, for instance, that malnutrition was common in Europe after the Second World War, and the UN set up a committee to decide what to do about it, but before they reported there was no malnutrition. In other words, the cultural history of Europe needed only for the war to stop for children to get priority, and malnutrition was not an issue. Anyway, I was doing a teaching session in a mountain village in Zaire for a week with some Africans, and by about Thursday I'd got to the end of my session, part of it, and I said to the Africans, you can finish in the tribal language, I'm walking home. Now the walk home was about a day's walk along the mountain, through some rainforest and down the mountain, and they said, you can't go on your own. And I said, it's a straightforward walk, I'm going on my own, I don't need any help. And then when I questioned them, it turned out that they didn't like walking through the rainforest on their own, whereas it didn't bother me. I questioned them further and found, in fact, they didn't like doing a lot of things after midnight sort of thing. They feared their environment, I didn't. So that was stowed away in the back of my mind. And then on that session I was asked to, on the way home, to come back through South Africa, and I had an amazing trip teaching in Soweto, in Baragwanath, and in Witwatersrand and Cape Town, finishing up in Pretoria with the Afrikaner students. And the guy had set me up for this, Professor Hansen from Witwatersrand, said, they will ask you this question. 200 or 300 years ago, our forefathers arrived in the Cape along with the Zulu, and both were equally destitute in material terms. The Hottentots got wiped out, but the Zulus and the Afrikaners are still here. We have no malnutrition, they have lots, with the clear implication for me to evade. I knew this was coming, and in the middle of the lecture I suddenly saw the answer. You know, it's the incredible phenomenon when you can see in a microsecond something that takes you days even to write down. But I knew the answer all of a sudden, just like that. So I said to the students, I know you're going to ask me this question. And with respect, I have to say to you that you are not equally destitute. And in order to make the point, I want to take you back to the time of Isaac Newton. Because Butterfield said of Isaac Newton, if Newton had not had his God, he would not have gone looking for his laws. There are some presuppositions to the way we understand the world. Whether we are Christian or not, they are Christian in origin, and they make science possible. They also make it necessary. Whereas in the East, science is still possible, but not necessary. For the animist, it is neither possible nor necessary, because the world is controlled by evil spirits, not by universal laws. And you did not share that insight with the African in a way that made sense to them. And to their credit, the students applauded and took the point. So now I knew that the problem lay in the area of the intellect, not in the area of nutrition. And it lay in the area of the sanctified intellect at some level. How was it that we changed? what makes us the kind of people that we are? To what do we give credit? And the next step forward came from listening to Professor Walke from Regent College talking about the law. And in the process of the talk, he said that Deuteronomy 6 is the most important chapter in the Old Testament. And I said, why? He said, well, it's the reason the Jews survived. So I read it because I didn't know it well. And I discovered later that Walker Percy had a lovely phrase that fits beautifully, which goes, why are there no Hittites on the streets of New York? Because the Hittites were a pagan race.
Yeah.
And they gave in to being dominated by the sexual impulse, became depraved, perverted, sacrificed their children, and they're gone, because God always wipes out such nations. He will not tolerate that. Now, why did the Jews survive? Well, they had an experience of God at Mount Sinai, which was awe-inspiring, but didn't make them good. They immediately trashed the first three commandments. And God said, when they made their initial promise before breaking the commandments, that this people would always have such a mind as this to keep my law, that it might go well with them and their children forever. There's a clear implication that they wouldn't, and of course they didn't. But in chapter 6, Moses, having shown them that their experience of God was not adequate, tells them what will be adequate. And it's, thou shalt love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your strength, with all your might. And what he goes on to say is how you do it. By teaching these things diligently to your children when you sit at table, when you rise up, when you lie down, when you go on a journey. So suddenly I began to see what's at issue for the development of virtue, which is different from conversion. Mm-hmm. We can't convert our kids, but we can certainly bring them up to be virtuous. But the way you do it is by spending time at the dining room table. A little later in the chapter, he even tells you how in detail. When your child asks you, what is the meaning of the rituals that we do, tell him the story, we were slaves in Egypt. God brought us out of Egypt through the desert right up to the present. What happens in that process is the child, by hearing those stories, not didactically taught, but conversed about and used as the means of communication between husband and wife, get a whole series of ideas about consequence, particularly moral consequence, and about character. The Bible is a consequential story about the character you get because of what you do. It's also a story of redemption because of God's grace. But those two are connected in very unusual ways. And the interesting thing from the point of view of our society and our profession is that in selecting people with that character and being interested in character, we preserve the profession, whether they believe or not. In Scotland, they say the child of the manse is the doctor and the lawyer of the next generation. And that's true. Because as Christians, we have reason for learning, which pagans don't have. They have reason for technology, but not for science. They don't have reason for the love of knowledge. They have it because they're made in the image of God. So these things have all come together for me as a means of understanding what we're about in terms of the missionary endeavor, which begins with evangelization, but absolutely must proceed to proper education. And proper in this instance means Christian. If there is no God, said Dostoevsky, everything is permissible. And that's exactly where we're living at the moment, in a world that denies that there is real objective moral good, that insists that all moral truth is personal and subjective, and that tolerance is the primary virtue. Now, each of those statements is untrue, and it's easy to show that it's untrue. But I don't meet 1 in 100 physicians who could do it. And the same with the students. So that's what I've got involved in now.
Tell me how you would prove those to be untrue.
Which one do you want first?
Well, you pick it.
Okay, well, let's start with the relativity of truth. Mm-hmm. The reality is that all cultures in the world have the same categories of thought. And they are what I call bipolar pairs. The physical world may be expanding, but the moral universe is fixed. Truth is one end of the line, falsehood is the other. Fidelity, infidelity. Justice, injustice. Honor, dishonor. Love, hatred. We all know these pairs. Mm-hmm. And in the end of the line in the direction of truth, you can't get beyond. A truth statement is the end of the line. There's nothing more truthful to be said about it. Mm-hmm. And a false statement is the other end of the line. There's nothing more false to be said about it. Truth is truth. You can't get behind it. When you've got a true statement, that's it. When you get to a false statement, that's it. You can't go any further. The problem is that those are very big concepts. Mm-hmm. And we live in a world which is defined by those limits. But in any given situation, we may not know whether this is actually true or this is actually false. The mistake we make is to say because we can't make this particular judgment, the real categories don't exist. And that's a philosophical mistake. They do exist. And if anybody really denies it, all you need to do is stamp on their toe and say that nothing happened. Because if there's no witnesses, it's totally subjective. But they know, and you know, that there is a real thing called justice, and there is a real thing called injustice, and I have no right to impose upon your person. In other words, rights are real. They're given by God, because we're made in the image of God. If we're just animals, all that exists is power. The lion does not ask the zebra for permission to eat breakfast, and we're moving in that direction. So objective moral truth exists, and always has, and the categories exist, but we live inside these limits, struggling with each of these bipolar descriptions of our world. And that's where a cultural story comes in. And this deals with multiculturalism too, because cultural stories are not equal. Some have greater explanatory power than the others, and that's what we need to recognize. So, for example, I usually tell a true story of seeing a child in Africa with a septic knee, and the only thing that could be done was an amputation. I don't tell the students it was in Africa. And I say that the parents said, we need to think about whether an amputation is acceptable to us. And within the hour they say, no, we will take her home to die. The missionary surgeon had seen this kind of decision before, went about his business. I was horrified. The nurses saw it was honourable, quite clearly. So I said, would you mind if I talked to you? And they said, no. And I said, well, what if this had been a little boy? What would you have done? And they said, oh, we'd have done the amputation. So I said, why would you treat little boys and little girls differently? And they said, in our culture, it's a woman's job to till the field, fetch the water, bear the children, cook the food. A woman with one leg will not get married, and therefore she will have a life not worth living. Now I can say to the students, if you're a multiculturalist, and all cultures are equal, you must accept that treatment of little girls as equally valid with ours. But if you do, you should get out of medicine because it's not compatible with the medicine that we practice. You must choose. Now, in most cases, the students just hate it, but can't get out of it. And I say, you see what I've done to you is not only have I dealt with the relativity of moral truth, I've dealt with the issue of multiculturalism. You've got to decide on given issues. And I've also actually dealt with the issue of tolerance, if you think about it, because I've shown you to be intolerant of treating little boys and little girls differently. And I would put it to you, in actual fact, you shouldn't be ashamed about that. And we complete the circle by saying that, in fact, whenever love is attacked, whenever justice is attacked, whenever truth is attacked, whenever honour is attacked, you have a duty to be intolerant. And the actual strange thing about our society is that it is dependent not upon tolerance, but upon intolerance. Because when our intolerances are appropriate, there's no child abuse because we won't tolerate it. There's no wife abuse because we won't tolerate it, and so on. And our society declines precisely at the point where we lose our sense of discrimination between good and evil.
And what we're willing to tolerate.
Exactly.
Great.
But now, you see, we have to work out what that means in terms of how we practice politics for a start. I mean, in medicine, we have been politically inert, asleep at the wheel. And the result is that we've allowed abortion to come in, in the States, it looks to me as though you're highly likely to get legalized assisted suicide in the very near future. We'll be the first nation to fully legalize assisted suicide in the world. What a horrendous thought.
And we think, people think we're enlightened because of it.
Well, some people do. Some must know. When Clinton refused to outlaw partial birth abortion, if anybody had told me the US president would do that 10 years ago, I wouldn't have believed it. It's all part of this process of losing contact with our cultural history and therefore not knowing what are the important questions. Because doctors are actually amongst the most ignorant people in the country now, because they cone down in order to get into medical school at about grade 8. They've read nothing outside of medicine and science. They're not the educated people that people like to think they are. They're very intelligent, but I call them highly intelligent barbarians, because a barbarian is somebody who doesn't know his own cultural history.
What would you've talked about physicians, and I think you're absolutely right. We're not fully educated. We're educated in a very specific area. A doctor that's going to begin that process, he's listening to this tape, he's saying, what should he get into? Give the first 5 books that you'd suggest he read.
Well, first of all, my favorite at the moment, the only thing I read from cover to cover is First Things. Mm-hmm. You won't read it from cover to cover when you first start. It's too hard to read. I suggest that you read The Naked Public Square by Richard John Newhouse at the end and go bullet by bullet forwards, because it starts light and gets heavier. And when you've completed that, then you go back to the front and read the short articles and slowly dig into the deep ones. But if you stick at it and read the book reviews and get the books that interest you, over a year or two, your colleagues will become more and more cautious about engaging you in debate, because you will become educated, inevitably. The intelligence is there, it's just that the material hasn't been given. The books that have mattered to me from this point of view over the last little while have been MacIntyre's After Virtue, Bloom's Closing the American Mind, Newbegin's various books, especially Foolishness to the Greeks, Paul Witz's Psychology as Religion. All these are ones that have really made a difference to the way I handle questions in medicine in the recent past. And of course, rereading Augustine's Confessions has been a very good recent process as well. The other thing that's happening in this area for me is that because of these kinds of issues coming up more and more, we've established a group of Christian professors in Ottawa, about 20 of us, and we're actually starting our own pre-university year for students in 1997. We're only taking bright kids. We want to train the next generation's leaders, and they will have no choice in that year. They will learn Latin. They will be introduced to the core of Western philosophy, Western literature, history of science and medicine, mathematics at the level of probability and logic, and a great books program, and the history of art. And
sounds like medical school may be a step down.
Oh, after that, but they'll be able to handle their professors. That's the basic point. And to our astonishment, there are a lot of kids who want to do that amount of work.
Oh, I can imagine. It would be tremendous value, and we've got to teach people how to think. That's the bottom line, and how to express themselves.
Yes. Yeah, and of course we don't know how to do that. We never have.
Yeah.
All we can do is point them to great thinkers. And as Lewis says, it's easy to pass political comment in The Abolition of Man. It's exceedingly difficult to teach criticism.
I know in Canada you've done a lot of speaking on university campuses, a lot of things. Tell us a little bit about that, the kind of the mission the Lord's called you to, because we kind of left you in Zaire on the path, I think.
Sure. Well,
and I know you do a lot more than that.
Yes. A few years ago now, the Christian Medical Dental Society in Canada asked me to do some teaching to medical students and physicians. I'd done some in Ontario when asked, and enjoyed it. But my initial comment was, "You're crazy. Why pay airfares for me to go across the country? There must be somebody locally who can do it." And they said, "You're joking. We don't have that kind of education available to us anymore." And so I think the first place they gave me to go was the Fraser Valley, which is the Bible Belt of Canada. Mm-hmm. And so I started in a physician's home in Chilliwack, 8 o'clock one evening, and I finally got home to bed in Vancouver at 1 o'clock in the morning. So I knew immediately that I'd stumbled upon a hole in education that people wanted filling. And I've even now had lunchtime lectures in universities where the kids have refused to go to classes in the afternoon because they recognize that they, as they put it, have been robbed by their university education. So the kinds of lectures I would give, the myth of moral neutrality, what's wrong with assisted suicide, why are there no Hittites on the streets of New York, what Hippocrates knew and we've forgotten, those kinds of subjects. And I have a lot of fun doing it.
Oh, I bet. People soak it up like a sponge.
Oh, well, something like that, anyway.
Well, I appreciate you spending some short time with us, and we want to have you on again on Christian Doctors Digest, because I think you've got a wealth of things to share with us, and we need to hear them. The fact that there are a lot of barbarians that have MDs after their name, I think that's the classic quote for today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'll do anything I can to help. It's been great.
Appreciate it. Thanks, John.
Thank you.